The gunshot that killed Samuel Greene's horse wasn't meant for the animal, but the bay mare took the bullet all the same, collapsing beneath him on the dusty main street of Prescott, Arizona Territory, in the scorching summer of 1878. Samuel hit the ground hard, rolling away from the thrashing animal as another shot rang out, this time striking the wooden post beside the general store where a young woman stood frozen, her hands full of fabric bolts she'd been examining. What caught Samuel's attention as he drew his revolver and returned fire at the fleeing bandits wasn't the near miss, but the fact that the woman hadn't flinched at the sound of gunfire that had sent every other person on the street diving for cover. She stood perfectly still, her green eyes wide but focused on the movement around her, rather than reacting to the explosive sounds that echoed off the false-fronted buildings. The bandits disappeared down an alley between the saloon and the barber shop, and Samuel didn't pursue them. His horse was dying, and that reality settled over him like the red dust that coated everything in this territorial town. He'd had that mare for 6 years, through cattle drives from Texas to Kansas and back again, through river crossings and stampedes and one memorable winter that had nearly killed them both. He knelt beside her now, placed his hand on her neck, and felt her go still beneath his palm. When he looked up, the young woman with the fabric bolts was watching him with an expression of such genuine sympathy that it caught him off guard. She set down her parcels carefully on the wooden sidewalk and walked toward him, her movements deliberate and graceful despite the chaos that had just unfolded. She knelt across from him, not caring that her blue calico dress was dragging in the dirt, and reached out to touch the mare's face with a gentleness that spoke of understanding. Her fingers traced the white star on the horse's forehead, and then she looked at Samuel with eyes that held a depth of feeling he couldn't quite name. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, and instead placed her hand over her heart and then gestured toward the horse with a sweeping motion that conveyed sorrow more eloquently than words. It was only then, watching her hands move with such intention, that Samuel understood. She couldn't hear the words he might say, but she could see his grief as clearly as if he'd shouted it. "Thank you," he said anyway, because it felt wrong not to acknowledge her kindness, and she seemed to understand the sentiment if not the actual words. She nodded once, then stood and returned to collect her parcels, leaving Samuel with the unpleasant task of dealing with his dead horse and the growing crowd of townspeople who were emerging from their hiding places now that the danger had passed. The sheriff, a thick-bellied man named Dockery, came huffing down the street with his deputy, both of them far too late to be of any use. "Those were the Cassidy brothers," Dockery announced as if this information was helpful. "Been causing trouble from here to Tucson. You hurt Greene." Samuel stood, brushing red dust from his vest and chaps. "Horse took the bullet that had my name on it. I'll need help moving her, and I'll need to buy another mount. Try Harrison's stable down past the church. He's got a few for sale." Dockery was already losing interest, his attention drawn to the bullet holes in the storefront and the broken window at the millinery. Could have been worse. Could have hit Miss Clara over there. That wouldn't have sat well with folks. Samuel followed the sheriff's gaze to where the young woman, apparently named Clara, was now inside the general store, visible through the window as she spoke with the proprietor, using her hands in rapid, fluid motions. The proprietor, an older woman with silver hair piled high on her head, responded in kind, her own hands moving with practiced ease. Samuel had seen sign language before, once, when a cattle drive had taken him through a town in New Mexico where a deaf man ran the telegraph office. He'd been fascinated by it then, by the way entire conversations could happen in silence, and he found himself equally fascinated now. "That's Clara Hartley," Dockery continued, clearly in the mood to talk now that the excitement was over. "Came here with her family about 4 years back. Her father's the surveyor who helped lay out the new mining claims up in the hills. Good family, respectable. The girl's deaf, has been since birth from what I understand. Shame, really. She's pretty enough, and sweet-tempered from what folks say, but she's been rejected by every man who's tried courting her. Most recent was Thomas Brennan's boy just last month. Guess fellows don't know what to do with a wife they can't talk to." Samuel felt an unexpected flash of anger at the casual dismissal in the sheriff's tone. "Seems to me she communicates just fine," he said, nodding toward the store where Clara was now laughing at something the proprietor had signed, her face lighting up with genuine joy that made her not just pretty but genuinely beautiful. Dockery shrugged. "Maybe so, but try running a household or raising children when you can't hear a baby cry or a pot boiling over. Practical matters, Greene. That's what it comes down to. Now, you want me to file a report about those Cassidy boys." Samuel did file a report, though he doubted it would lead anywhere. The Cassidy brothers were small-time outlaws who preyed on travelers, and occasionally got bold enough to try something in town, but they weren't important enough for any serious manhunt. What mattered more to Samuel was replacing his horse and figuring out what his next move would be. He'd come to Prescott looking for work, hoping to hire on with one of the big ranches that sprawled across the grasslands north of town. He was good with horses, better with cattle, and at 26 years old, he'd spent more than half his life working ranches from Texas to Montana. He had money saved, enough to buy a decent horse and pay for a room while he looked for steady employment, but the death of his mare felt like a bad omen. He made arrangements for the horse's body to be removed, then walked down to Harrison's stable with his saddle over his shoulder and his rifle in his free hand. The stable was a long, low building that smelled of hay and leather and horse sweat, familiar scents that were oddly comforting after the violence of the afternoon. Harrison himself was a lean man in his 50s with a completely bald head and sharp blue eyes that assessed Samuel in one quick glance. "Heard about your trouble," Harrison said by way of greeting. "Sorry about your mare. I've got 3 horses for sale right now, 2 geldings and a mare. The mare's Greene, only 4 years old, but she's got good lines. The geldings are older, steadier. Depends what you need." Samuel spent the next hour looking over the horses, testing their temperaments, checking their teeth and hooves and legs. He settled finally on one of the geldings, a sturdy buckskin with a calm eye and solid build. The price was fair, and Samuel paid it without haggling, too tired from the day's events to care about saving a few dollars. By the time he led his new horse, which he decided to name Buck for lack of any better inspiration, to the boarding house where he'd taken a room, the sun was setting behind the mountains and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Samuel had been in the mood to appreciate them. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Kowalski, who served dinner family style at 6 o'clock sharp and didn't tolerate drinking or gambling on the premises. Samuel washed up at the pump in the yard, changed into a clean shirt, and made it to the dining room just as Mrs. Kowalski was setting a platter of fried chicken on the table. There were 6 other boarders, all men, ranging from a young clerk who worked at the land office to an older prospector who spent most meals talking about the silver strike he was certain was just one more shaft away. Samuel took an empty seat and helped himself to chicken and potatoes and green beans, listening to the conversation flow around him without contributing much. It was the clerk, a nervous fellow named Patterson, who brought up the shooting. "I saw the whole thing from the land office window." Those Cassidy brothers are getting bolder. Could have killed someone today. Nearly hit Clara Hartley, and wouldn't that have been a tragedy? Pretty girl, the prospector agreed. Shame about the deafness. Her father's a good man, knows his business, but that girl can't see how she'll ever marry. What man wants a wife he can't speak to? Samuel set down his fork with more force than necessary. She can speak, just not with her voice. Those hand signs, they're a language same as English or Spanish or any other. The prospector raised his eyebrows. You know sign language, do you? No, Samuel admitted, but I know communication when I see it. She was talking to Mrs. Patterson at the general store just fine. Mrs. Patterson learned the signs because Clara's been shopping there for years, Patterson explained. There's maybe a dozen people in town who know it well enough to really talk to her. Her family, of course, and some of the shopkeepers. The preacher learned some, and Doc Morrison. But most folks just smile and nod and don't know what to do with her. Mrs. Kowalski, bringing in a second platter of biscuits, made a disapproving sound. Clara Hartley is a lovely young woman, and it's a disgrace how she's been treated. Thomas Brennan's son courted her for 3 months, led her to believe he was serious, and then broke it off because his mother said she wouldn't have a deaf woman in the family. Broke Clara's heart, though she held her head high through it all. She's got more dignity than half the people in this town. Samuel found himself thinking about Clara Hartley as he finished his dinner and excused himself to his room. He'd been in Prescott for less than a day, and already he felt drawn into the story of this woman he'd barely met. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she certainly was. It was something about the way she'd knelt beside his dying horse, the way her sympathy had been so clear despite the lack of spoken words. There had been a connection in that moment, brief as it was, and Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something. The next morning, Samuel set about finding work. He visited 3 different ranches, each a few miles out of town, and came away with offers from 2 of them. The better offer came from a spread called the Triple Bar, owned by a man named Douglas Mackenzie, who ran cattle and horses on 20,000 acres of grassland and pine forest. Mackenzie was a Scotsman who'd come to Arizona Territory 15 years earlier and built his ranch through a combination of hard work and smart business. He offered Samuel $40 a month plus room and board, and the job would start in a week, giving Samuel time to get properly outfitted and to let Buck adjust to his new owner before they headed out to ranch work. With his immediate future settled, Samuel found himself at loose ends. He spent the afternoon in the saloon, nursing a single beer and playing cards with a group of ranch hands who were in town for supplies. He won a little, lost a little, and learned the names of most of the major players in the territory's cattle business. But his mind kept wandering back to Clara Hartley, and when he left the saloon in the late afternoon, he found his feet carrying him toward the general store almost without conscious decision. The store was busy with afternoon shoppers, mostly women selecting items for their evening meals or examining the latest fabrics that had arrived on the stage from Tucson. Samuel pretended to be interested in a new pair of work gloves while he scanned the store, feeling foolish and not quite sure what he was doing. Then he saw her near the back, examining a display of ribbons with careful attention. She wore a different dress today, pale yellow with white trim, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun that showed the elegant line of her neck. Samuel took a breath, set down the gloves, and walked over to her before he could talk himself out of it. When his shadow fell across the ribbons, she looked up with a polite, questioning expression that shifted to recognition when she saw his face. She smiled, just a small curve of her lips, and Samuel felt absurdly pleased that she remembered him. He gestured toward the ribbons, then at her, trying to indicate that he thought they would suit her. but his movements were clumsy and he knew he probably looked ridiculous. Clara's smile widened, though, and she picked up a ribbon in a shade of green that matched her eyes, holding it up for his opinion. Samuel nodded enthusiastically, then felt his face heat with embarrassment at his own awkwardness. Clara's expression softened, and she set down the ribbon to pull a small notebook and pencil from her pocket. She wrote quickly, her handwriting neat and precise, then turned the notebook so he could read it. "Thank you for your kindness yesterday with your horse. I am sorry for your loss. My name is Clara Hartley." Samuel took the pencil she offered and wrote beneath her words, his own handwriting less elegant but readable. "I am Samuel Greene. Thank you for your sympathy. It meant a great deal. The green ribbon is very pretty." Clara read his words, and her smile reached her eyes this time, warming her whole face. She wrote again. "Are you staying in Prescott? I just hired on at the Triple Bar Ranch. I start next week. I am new to the area. Welcome to Prescott. It is a good town despite yesterday's excitement. Where are you from?" They continued their conversation through written words, passing the notebook back and forth while other shoppers moved around them. Samuel learned that Clara was 23 years old, that she'd been born in Ohio, but her family had moved west when she was 19, following her father's work as a surveyor. She had one younger sister, Margaret, who was 20 and recently engaged to a merchant's son. Clara loved reading, horseback riding, and helping her mother with the garden they kept behind their house on the edge of town. She asked Samuel about his work, his travels, the places he'd seen during his years as a ranch hand. The conversation flowed more easily than Samuel had expected, though the writing was slow and sometimes he struggled to find the right words to express what he meant. Clara was patient, though, and occasionally she would add a gesture or an expression that clarified meaning beyond the written words. Samuel found himself fascinated by the way she communicated, by the richness of her expressions, and the eloquence of her hands even when they weren't forming the signs he didn't yet understand. Mrs. Patterson eventually came over, her hands moving in quick signs that Clara responded to with equal speed. Then Clara turned back to Samuel and wrote in the notebook, "Mrs. Patterson says the store will close soon. I should make my purchases. It was very nice talking with you, Samuel." Samuel wrote back quickly, not wanting to lose this connection. "May I call on you? I would like to continue our conversation." He saw uncertainty flicker across Clara's face, a wariness that suggested she'd been disappointed before. She wrote slowly this time, as if choosing her words with care. "Are you certain? Most men find it too difficult to communicate with me." Samuel took the pencil and wrote with firm conviction, "I find you easier to talk to than most people I meet. Please say yes." Clara bit her lower lip, and Samuel watched a dozen emotions play across her face before she finally nodded and wrote down an address. "Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock. My parents will want to meet you." "I will be there," Samuel wrote, and the smile Clara gave him made him feel like he'd just won something far more valuable than any card game. That evening, back at the boarding house, Samuel asked Mrs. Kowalski if she knew where he might find a book on sign language. The widow looked at him with sharp interest, her eyes twinkling with speculation, but she simply directed him to the small lending library that operated out of a room in the church. The next morning, Saturday, Samuel visited the church and found a slim volume titled The American Sign Language, a guide to manual communication. The librarian, an elderly man who also served as the church sexton, seemed pleased by Samuel's interest and waived the usual lending fee. Samuel spent the rest of Saturday and most of Sunday morning poring over the book, practicing the hand shapes and movements until his fingers ached. The alphabet was relatively straightforward: each letter represented by a specific hand position, but the words and concepts were more complex, often involving movement and position in space that was hard to learn from static drawings on a page. Still, Samuel was determined. He practiced in his room in the stable with Buck, and even at the dinner table until Mrs. Kowalski told him to please eat his food before it got cold. Sunday afternoon arrived with merciless speed. Samuel dressed in his best clothes, a clean white shirt, and his only vest without any worn spots, pressed trousers and polished boots. He'd gotten a haircut and a shave that morning, and he checked his appearance 3 times in the small mirror in his room, before finally accepting that he looked as good as he was going to look. He rode Buck out to the address Clara had given him, a neat house with white painted siding and a well-tended garden that spoke of care and attention. Samuel tied Buck to the hitching post and was halfway up the walk when the front door opened, and Clara appeared, wearing a dress in soft blue that made her eyes even more striking. She smiled at him, a genuine expression of welcome that eased some of his nervousness, and then her mother appeared behind her, a handsome woman in her late 40s who regarded Samuel with frank assessment. Behind her came a man who had to be Clara's father, tall and thin with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Clara's hands moved in introduction, and Samuel caught his own name in the signs, but her mother spoke aloud while simultaneously signing. "Mr. Greene, I am Elizabeth Hartley and this is my husband, Robert. Clara has told us you wish to call on her. Please, come inside." The Hartley home was comfortable and clearly well-loved, with books on shelves and photographs on the walls and furniture that showed wear but was clean and cared for. Samuel was directed to a chair in the parlor while Mr. Hartley took a seat across from him, and Mrs. Hartley settled on the sofa beside Clara. For a moment, silence hung in the room and Samuel felt the weight of parental scrutiny. "Clara tells us you just arrived in Prescott, Mr. Hartley said, his voice measured. His hands moved as he spoke, and Samuel realized the whole family signed even when speaking aloud, ensuring Clara never missed a word of what was said. "Yes, sir, just 2 days ago. I've hired on at the Triple Bar Ranch, working for Mr. Mackenzie. Douglas Mackenzie is a good man, runs a solid operation. You have ranching experience?" "Yes, sir. I've worked ranches since I was 14 years old. Cattle mostly, but I'm good with horses too. I've been up the trail to Kansas 3 times, worked spreads in Texas, New Mexico, and Montana. I'm looking to settle somewhere permanent now, and the Triple Bar seems like a good opportunity." Mrs. Hartley leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Greene, Clara mentioned that you communicated with her through writing. Are you aware that she is deaf, that she cannot hear or speak?" Samuel met her eyes directly. "Yes, ma'am. Clara made that clear, though I would say she speaks very well through her hands and her expressions. I borrowed a book on sign language from the library. I don't know much yet, but I am learning." He saw surprise flicker across both parents' faces, and Clara's expression brightened with something that looked like hope. Samuel turned to her and carefully, slowly, formed the signs he'd practiced. "Hello. Nice to see you again." His hand shapes were clumsy and his movement awkward, but Clara's face lit up like sunrise, and her hands flew in response, far too fast for him to follow. Her mother laughed, a warm sound, and signed something that made Clara duck her head with a smile that suggested embarrassment. "Clara is pleased," Mrs. Hartley translated, though Samuel had already guessed as much. "She says you are the first man who has ever tried to learn her language. She also says your signing is terrible, but she appreciates the effort." "I am sure my signing is terrible," Samuel agreed with a smile. "But I will get better with practice, if Clara is willing to teach me." What followed was one of the most unusual courtship conversations Samuel had ever experienced. Mr. and Mrs. Hartley asked him questions about his background, his family, his intentions, and his prospects, all while signing everything that was said so Clara could participate fully. Samuel learned that he was not the first man to come courting, but he was apparently the first to last more than one visit. Thomas Brennan's son had courted Clara for 3 months, but had never learned a single sign, relying on Clara to read his lips or write notes, and had ultimately decided the challenge was too great. "I will be honest with you, Mr. Greene," Robert Hartley said after about an hour of conversation. "Clara has been hurt before by men who claimed interest, but ultimately saw her deafness as an insurmountable obstacle. My wife and I love our daughter deeply, and we have watched her bear rejection with more grace than those men deserved. If you are not serious in your intentions, if you have any doubts about your ability to build a life with a woman who cannot hear, then I ask you to walk away now, before anyone's feelings become more involved." Samuel took a moment to consider his answer, because the question deserved honest reflection. He looked at Clara, who watched him with an expression that tried to be neutral but couldn't quite hide her vulnerability. He thought about the past 2 days, the way she'd stayed in his mind, the feeling of connection he'd experienced both at the general store and here in her home. He thought about the book he'd studied, the way his hands had fumbled through signs, and his determination to learn more. "Mr. Hartley, Mrs. Hartley," he said finally, making sure to meet their eyes as well as Clara's. "I will not pretend that I understand what building a life with Clara would involve. I have only just met her, and I have a lot to learn about sign language and about her world. But I can tell you honestly that Clara's deafness does not trouble me. What I see is an intelligent, kind, beautiful woman who communicates just fine, even if it is in a different way than I am used to. I would like the opportunity to court your daughter properly, to learn her language and let her learn about me, and to see if we might build something meaningful together. I cannot promise where it will lead, but I can promise that I will not walk away simply because communication requires more effort." He saw tears shine in Mrs. Hartley's eyes, and she signed something to Clara that made Clara press her hands to her own face. Then Clara was signing rapidly to her mother, who nodded and turned to Samuel. "Clara would like to speak to you herself, if you will permit me to translate until your signing improves." "Of course," Samuel said, and watched as Clara's hands began to move with graceful precision. "Clara says," Mrs. Hartley translated, her voice taking on an emotional quality that suggested she was conveying not just words but feeling, "that she has spent most of her life being told she is too difficult, too much work, not worth the effort it takes to truly know her. She says that men have smiled at her and treated her kindly, but never as a full person, always as someone limited by what she cannot do rather than valued for what she can do. She says that you are the first person outside her family who has treated her as an equal from the beginning, who saw her language as something worth learning rather than an obstacle to avoid. She says she would very much like for you to court her, and she promises to be patient while you learn to sign, because she knows it is not easy." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. He turned to Clara and tried to sign what he wanted to say, but he didn't know enough words yet, so he resorted to the notebook he'd brought, anticipating this need. He wrote, "You are not too much. You are not too difficult. You are extraordinary, and I am honored that you would give me this chance." Clara read his words, and when she looked up at him, the tears in her eyes were matched by the radiant smile on her face. She signed something brief, and her mother laughed. "She says you may stay for dinner." Dinner with the Hartley family was a revelation. Clara's younger sister Margaret joined them. a lively young woman who signed as naturally as she spoke, and who immediately began testing Samuel's seriousness by asking him difficult questions about his intentions and his prospects. The whole family moved fluidly between spoken English and sign language, often doing both simultaneously, and Samuel began to understand just how much work he had ahead of him if he wanted to truly communicate with Clara on her terms. But he also saw the joy on Clara's face as she told stories through her hands, her expressions and gestures adding layers of meaning that made everyone laugh or lean in with interest. He saw the warmth of a family that had clearly worked hard to ensure their deaf daughter was never excluded or left behind. And he felt the rightness of his decision, the certainty that pursuing this relationship with Clara was exactly what he was meant to be doing. After dinner with Mrs. Hartley's permission, Samuel and Clara sat together on the front porch while the sun set behind the mountains. They passed the notebook back and forth, their written conversation supplemented by Samuel's halting attempts at signing and Clara's patient corrections. He learned that she'd been rejected by 7 men before Thomas Brennan's son, each rejection a variation on the same theme. She was lovely, but her deafness was too complicated, too challenging, too much to overcome. The most painful had been a man who'd courted her for 6 months, and whom she'd believed truly cared for her, only to discover he'd been courting a hearing woman in another town the whole time, and had only pursued Clara as a passing entertainment. Samuel wrote furiously, "Those men were fools. Their loss is my gain. I promise I am not courting anyone else in another town or anywhere else. You are the only woman I am interested in." Clara's smile was soft and a little uncertain, as if she wanted to believe him but was afraid to fully trust. She wrote, "It is early days yet. You have only known me for 3 days. You might change your mind." "I might," Samuel admitted in writing, because honesty seemed important. "But not because of your deafness. Only if we discover we do not suit each other in other ways, which can happen with any courtship. But I do not think that will happen. I think we will suit each other very well." Clara studied his face for a long moment, and Samuel met her gaze steadily, letting her see his sincerity. Finally, she nodded and wrote, "Then I look forward to discovering if you are right." Samuel started work at the Triple Bar Ranch the following Monday, which meant moving out of Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house and into the ranch's bunkhouse with the other hands. The work was hard but familiar. Riding fence lines, moving cattle between pastures, breaking horses, making repairs to buildings and equipment. Samuel fell into the rhythm of ranch life easily, rising before dawn and working until after sunset, earning his $40 a month through sweat and saddle sores, and the occasional near miss with an ornery steer. But every Sunday, he rode Buck the hour and a half back into Prescott to spend the afternoon with Clara. Sometimes they sat in the Hartley parlor with her parents nearby, maintaining propriety. Sometimes they walked through town together, Clara's hand resting lightly on Samuel's arm while they window shopped or visited the small park near the church. And every visit, Samuel's signing improved. He practiced every night in the bunkhouse, much to the amusement of the other ranch hands, drilling himself on vocabulary and grammar until his fingers moved with increasing confidence. Clara was an excellent teacher, patient with his mistakes but firm in her corrections. She taught him not just the signs but the grammar of sign language, the way it structured sentences differently than English, the importance of facial expressions and body language in conveying meaning. She taught him that sign language wasn't just English translated into hand shapes, but its own language with its own rules and its own beauty. By the end of September, Samuel could hold simple conversations entirely in sign. By October, He no longer needed the notebook for most things he wanted to say. By November, he was signing fluently enough that Clara's father complimented his dedication, and her mother admitted she'd never seen anyone learn so quickly. The other ranch hands at the Triple Bar found Samuel's courtship highly entertaining. They teased him good-naturedly about riding all the way to town every Sunday, about practicing his hand signs over dinner, about the lovesick expression they claimed he wore whenever Clara's name came up. But they also respected his dedication, and several of them asked him to teach them basic signs. Samuel obliged, and soon there were 5 cowboys at the Triple Bar who could sign hello, thank you, and pretty lady, though the last was mostly used to make each other laugh. Mackenzie, the ranch owner, called Samuel into his office in mid-November. Samuel went with some trepidation, wondering if his Sunday absences were going to become a problem, but Mackenzie simply wanted to offer him a raise and a new position. "You are good with horses, Greene, better than most. I want you to take over the horse training program starting in January. That is $50 a month and your own cabin instead of the bunkhouse. Interested?" Samuel accepted immediately, both for the money and the opportunity, but also because a private cabin meant a place where he could potentially bring a wife, if things with Clara continued as he hoped they would. He didn't say that to Mackenzie, but the older man gave him a knowing look and told him to keep up the good work. Christmas of 1878 was the best Samuel could remember. He'd saved enough money to buy Clara a beautiful shawl he'd seen in the general store, deep green wool with delicate embroidery that he thought would suit her perfectly. He also bought her a book of poetry, because she'd mentioned loving to read, and a blank journal with a leather cover, thinking she might use it for writing since written words were still part of how they communicated, even though signing had become their primary language. Clara gave him a pair of leather gloves she'd made herself, perfectly fitted and beautifully crafted, and a book about horse training that she'd ordered specially from San Francisco. But the gift that meant the most was a small framed drawing she'd made, a sketch of Samuel sitting on Buck, captured with such skill that Samuel was momentarily speechless. He hadn't known she could draw. "You have been teaching me your language," Clara signed, her movements elegant and expressive. "I wanted to give you something of my language, too. Drawing is how I see the world, how I capture it when I cannot hear it. This is how I see you, strong and kind and steady." Samuel set the drawing down carefully and signed back. "It is beautiful. You are beautiful. Thank you." They were in the Hartley parlor, with her family busy in other parts of the house, giving them a measure of privacy. Samuel took Clara's hands in his, feeling the slight calluses on her fingers from all her drawing and handwork, and he met her eyes with an intensity of feeling that made his heart pound. "I love you," he signed, the movement simple but weighted with emotion. "I have loved you for months now. I wanted you to know." Clara's eyes widened, and he saw tears begin to form, but they were clearly happy tears because she was smiling, a brilliant expression of joy that made her whole face glow. Her hands moved quickly. "I love you too. I have wanted to tell you, but I was afraid. Afraid you would decide I am too much trouble after all." "Never," Samuel signed emphatically. "You are not trouble. You are everything I want." He kissed her then, a gentle press of lips that quickly deepened as Clara's arms came up around his neck and his hands settled on her waist. It was their first kiss, and it felt like a promise, a seal on the feelings they'd both just confessed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara was laughing silently, her eyes dancing with happiness, and Samuel felt like the luckiest man in the entire Arizona Territory. January of 1879 brought changes. Samuel moved into his new cabin, a small but sturdy structure with a main room that served as living area and kitchen, a separate bedroom, and a front porch with a view of the mountains. He spent his spare time making it comfortable, building furniture and hanging curtains, and generally making it into a home rather than just a place to sleep. The other ranch hands knew exactly what he was doing and ribbed him about it constantly, but it was all good-natured. Everyone at the Triple Bar knew that Samuel was serious about Clara Hartley, and most of them had met her by now since she'd visited the ranch twice, once with her parents and once with just her sister as chaperone. Clara had charmed everyone at the Triple Bar. She'd brought cookies she'd baked, had taught several of the hands some additional signs, and had spent an hour working with a young mare that was proving difficult to train, gentling the horse with a patience and skill that impressed even Mackenzie. The ranch hands had watched in fascination, as Samuel and Clara communicated entirely in sign language, their hands moving in rapid conversation while they worked together with the mare. And more than one man had commented afterward that it was clear the two of them were meant for each other. February brought the question Samuel had been building toward for months. He'd saved enough money for a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone that he'd purchased from a jeweler in Prescott. He'd asked Mr. Hartley for permission to marry Clara, a conversation that had required his best signing skills and a fair amount of nervousness. Mr. Hartley had been serious but ultimately approving, shaking Samuel's hand and welcoming him to the family. Mrs. Hartley had hugged him and cried, telling him he was exactly the man they'd hoped Clara would find. But Samuel wanted the proposal itself to be special, something that honored Clara and their relationship. He'd been thinking about it for weeks, planning the perfect moment, and he'd finally settled on a plan. He invited Clara to visit the ranch on a Sunday afternoon, telling her he wanted to show her something special. She'd arrived with her father as chaperone. Since unmarried women didn't visit men alone, even men they were courting seriously. Samuel took them to the horse pasture where a new foal had been born just days earlier, a pretty bay filly with a white star on her forehead that reminded Samuel painfully of his lost mare. "I wanted you to name her," Samuel signed to Clara. "If you will agree to marry me, this filly will be your wedding gift. You can name her and train her and she will be completely yours." Clara stared at him, her eyes wide with shock, and for a horrible moment Samuel thought he'd miscalculated, that it was too soon or he'd done something wrong. But then her hands flew into motion. "Did you just propose to me? Are you asking me to marry you?" Samuel dropped to one knee right there in the pasture dirt, pulling the ring from his pocket. He signed one-handed awkwardly. "Yes, I am asking you to marry me. I love you, Clara. I want to spend my life with you. I have learned your language because I wanted you to be able to say yes or no in your own words, not through translation or writing, but directly from you to me. So this answer is ours, no one else's. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Clara's face, and her hands trembled as she signed. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you. I love you so much." Samuel stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, holding her tight while she cried happy tears into his shoulder. Over her head he saw Mr. Hartley wiping at his own eyes and smiling, giving Samuel a nod of approval and welcome. The foal, oblivious to the momentous occasion, frolicked nearby while her mother grazed peacefully. It was a perfect moment, exactly what Samuel had hoped for. They set the wedding for late April, giving them time to prepare, but not so long that they'd have to wait forever. Clara wanted a simple ceremony in the church with a reception at her parents' house, and Samuel agreed to everything she suggested because he didn't care about the details as long as the end result was being married to her. He did insist on paying for as much as he could, using his saved wages to purchase food for the reception, and to buy Clara a wedding dress she fell in love with at the dressmaker's shop. The months between the proposal and the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Samuel continued his work at the Triple Bar, training horses and managing the expanding horse program that Mackenzie wanted to develop. Clara prepared her trousseau, sewing clothes and linens and all the practical items they'd need to set up their household. They spent every possible moment together, and Samuel's signing became so fluent that he sometimes forgot they were using a different language than the one he'd grown up speaking. April arrived with warm days and cool nights, wildflowers blooming across the Arizona hills. The wedding was set for the last Saturday of the month, and the whole town seemed excited about it. Clara was well known in Prescott, and the story of the cowboy who'd learned sign language to court her had spread through the community with the speed of wildfire. People who barely knew Samuel would stop him on the street to congratulate him, or to tell him they thought what he'd done was romantic and admirable. The night before the wedding, Samuel stayed in town at the boarding house, since tradition dictated he shouldn't see Clara before the ceremony. He barely slept, too full of anticipation and joy and a bone-deep certainty that he was making the right choice. When morning came, he dressed in new clothes he'd bought specifically for the occasion. Black trousers, a white shirt, a black vest and jacket, and a string tie that Clara had given him, declaring it very handsome on him. The church was full when Samuel arrived, packed with people from town and a large contingent from the Triple Bar Ranch. Mackenzie was there with his wife, and all the ranch hands had ridden in for the occasion, scrubbed clean and dressed in their Sunday best. Samuel stood at the front of the church with the preacher, a kind man named Reverend Matthews who'd learned to sign specifically, so he could conduct the ceremony in both spoken English and sign language, ensuring Clara would miss none of her own wedding. Then the music began, and Clara appeared at the back of the church on her father's arm, and Samuel forgot to breathe. She wore a dress of ivory silk with lace at the throat and sleeves, her dark hair piled elegantly on her head with small flowers woven through it. But what captured Samuel completely was her face, radiant with joy and love and absolute certainty as she walked down the aisle toward him. The ceremony was beautiful. Reverend Matthews spoke and signed simultaneously, his movements practiced and clear, addressing both the hearing and deaf members of the congregation. Samuel and Clara exchanged vows, signing their promises to each other with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Clara thoroughly, to the cheers and applause of everyone present. In that moment, Samuel felt like his life had finally found its true course, like everything before had been leading to this woman, this love, this future they would build together. The reception at the Hartley house was joyful chaos. There was food and music and dancing, though Clara couldn't hear the music, and so Samuel had learned to feel the rhythm through the floorboards and to guide her through the steps. Their first dance as husband and wife accomplished through touch and trust rather than sound. People lined up to congratulate them, and Samuel was moved to see several townspeople attempting to sign their good wishes to Clara, their efforts clumsy but sincere. As the sun set and guests began to leave, Samuel and Clara said their goodbyes and rode out to the Triple Bar together, Clara on the bay filly she'd named Star, Samuel on Buck. The cabin that was now their home glowed with lamplight, and Samuel had filled it with wildflowers earlier in the week, wanting everything to be perfect for their first night as husband and wife. He helped Clara down from Star, then signed, "Welcome home, Mrs. Greene." Clara signed back with a smile that outshone the sunset. "I love how that sounds. I love you." "I love you too," Samuel signed, then swept her up in his arms and carried her across the threshold, her laughter silent but visible in every line of her body. Their life together began in earnest. Clara proved to be everything Samuel had hoped and more. A partner in running their household, a skilled horsewoman who helped with training, a loving wife who made their small cabin feel like a true home. She planted a garden, sewed curtains, cooked meals that the other ranch hands begged to be invited to share, and brought a joy and warmth to the triple bar that everyone noticed and appreciated. Samuel continued to learn and grow in his understanding of sign language and deaf culture. Clara taught him about the challenges she faced, the way people often talked about her as if she wasn't there, the casual exclusion that happened when hearing people forgot to include her in conversations. Samuel became fierce in his protection of his wife's dignity, making sure people signed when speaking to her, insisting on interpreters at important meetings, and gently educating anyone who treated Clara as less capable because of her deafness. Summer brought their first real challenge as a married couple when a fire broke out in the southern pasture, started by lightning and spreading quickly through the dry grass. Samuel was out fighting the fire with the other ranch hands, working desperately to create fire breaks and save the cattle trapped beyond the flames. Clara, back at the cabin, couldn't hear the alarm bells or the shouting, but she saw the smoke and understood immediately what was happening. She did something that terrified Samuel when he later learned about it. She rode Star directly toward the fire, finding the cattle that the men had missed in their confusion and driving them to safety through her skill and determination. She saved 20 head of cattle that day, but she also put herself in terrible danger. And when Samuel found her afterward, smoke-stained and exhausted but unharmed, he pulled her off her horse and held her so tightly she made a small sound of protest. "Do not ever do something that dangerous again," he signed frantically when he finally released her enough to communicate. "I thought I might lose you. I cannot lose you." Clara's face was serious as she signed back. "Those cattle would have died. I had to help. This is my ranch too, our life together. I will not sit safely at home when I can make a difference." Samuel realized in that moment that he'd been unconsciously trying to protect Clara not just from prejudice, but from risk, treating her as more fragile because of her deafness. But she was strong and capable and determined to be a full partner in their life, not someone to be sheltered. He nodded slowly and signed, "You are right. I am sorry, but please be careful. You are the most important thing in my world." "You are the most important thing in mine," Clara signed back. "Which is why I understand your fear. We will protect each other, but we will not cage each other." "Agreed." "Agreed," Samuel signed and sealed the promise with a kiss. Fall of 1879 brought news that changed everything. Clara was pregnant. She told Samuel one evening in late September, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach, her eyes bright with joy and a hint of nervousness. Samuel's heart nearly burst with happiness. He signed rapid questions. "When? How are you feeling? Do you need anything?" Clara laughed at his excitement and answered each question patiently. The baby would come in early spring. She felt well except for some morning sickness, and what she needed most was for him to stop worrying so much. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through fall and into winter. Clara continued her normal activities for as long as she felt able, and Samuel tried not to hover too obviously, though he couldn't help watching her for signs of distress or discomfort. Mackenzie, learning of the pregnancy, gave Samuel a raise and told him to take whatever time he needed when the baby arrived. The other ranch hands were excited, already betting on whether it would be a boy or girl and arguing about potential names. Clara's parents were overjoyed at the prospect of becoming grandparents. Her mother came to stay at the cabin for the last few weeks of the pregnancy, wanting to be there to help with the birth and the early days afterward. Dr. Morrison, who'd learned some sign language specifically to communicate with Clara, visited regularly to check on her progress and to ensure everything was proceeding normally. The baby came on a clear morning in late March of 1880, arriving after a labor that was mercifully shorter than everyone had feared. Samuel paced outside the cabin while Clara's mother and Dr. Morrison attended the birth, and when the doctor finally emerged to tell him he had a son, Samuel nearly collapsed with relief and joy. He rushed inside to find Clara exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets that she immediately held out to show him. The baby was perfect, impossibly small with a shock of dark hair and his mother's delicate features. Samuel held his son with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the fierce love that swept through him. Then a terrible thought occurred to him, and he looked at Clara with panic in his eyes, trying to figure out how to ask the question he was suddenly terrified about. But Clara understood, and she signed with one hand while supporting the baby with the other. "The doctor says it is too early to know if he can hear. We will know in time, but whatever he is, hearing or deaf, we will love him and raise him well." Samuel nodded, realizing she was right. It didn't matter. They would figure it out either way, just as they'd figured out everything else. He kissed Clara's forehead and signed, "He is beautiful. You are amazing. I love you both so much." They named the baby James Robert Greene, James for Samuel's father who died years ago, Robert for Clara's father who'd welcomed Samuel into the family so completely. James was a good baby, crying normally and sleeping in stretches that allowed Clara to rest and recover. As the weeks passed, it became clear that James could hear. He startled at loud noises and turned his head toward sounds, and while there was a flicker of something complicated in Clara's eyes when this became certain, there was also relief and acceptance. "He will need to learn both languages," Clara signed to Samuel when James was about 2 months old. "He will need to speak for the hearing world but also sign so he can always talk to me. You and I must make sure he grows up comfortable in both worlds." "We will," Samuel promised. "He will grow up knowing that his mother's language is just as important and valuable as spoken English. We will make sure of that." They kept that promise. As James grew, they spoke to him in English and signed to him constantly, ensuring he learned both languages simultaneously. By the time he was a year old, James was babbling in sounds and making approximations of signs. By 18 months, he could sign simple concepts and speak simple words, and he never seemed to see his mother's deafness as a limitation, only as a natural part of who she was. Life at the Triple Bar continued to be good to the Greene family. Samuel's horse training program was highly successful, and Mackenzie expanded his operations, bringing Samuel in as a partner rather than just an employee. By 1882, Samuel had a stake in the ranch and a voice in major decisions. The cabin was expanded to include 2 more rooms, giving James his own space and providing room for the second baby that came in late 1882, a daughter they named Catherine after Clara's grandmother. Catherine turned out to be deaf like her mother, which they discovered when she was about 6 months old and showed none of the startle reflexes that James had exhibited. Samuel saw fear flicker across Clara's face when this became clear, and he understood why. Clara was afraid their daughter would face the same rejection and prejudice she'd experienced, the same casual dismissal and exclusion that had marked so much of Clara's life before Samuel. But Samuel took his wife's hands and signed with absolute conviction. "Catherine will grow up knowing she is perfect exactly as she is. She will learn sign language from birth, and she will be part of a community that values her. The world is changing, Clara." It is changing partly because of people like you, people who refuse to be limited by others' ignorance. Our daughter will have a better experience than you did. We will make sure of it." Clara cried, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. She signed, "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I am the lucky one," Samuel signed back. "You gave me a new language, a new way of seeing the world. You gave me a family and a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me everything." The years flowed past with the rhythm of ranch life. Spring brandings, summer roundups, fall cattle drives, winter preparations. James grew into a lively, bright boy who moved effortlessly between the hearing world and his mother's deaf world, interpreting for her when needed, but also fiercely insisting that others learn to sign, rather than always relying on him to translate. Catherine grew into a sweet, thoughtful child who was curious about everything, and learned to read remarkably early, devouring books from the library and drawing pictures like her mother. In 1885, another son arrived named Thomas, who turned out to be hearing like James. The Greene cabin was full of noise and silence, spoken words and signed conversations, a chaotic blend that somehow worked perfectly. Samuel taught all his children to ride and work cattle, to respect horses and understand the land. Clara taught them to read and draw and think critically, to stand up for themselves and others, to see deafness not as a disability but simply as a different way of experiencing the world. The town of Prescott changed too as the years passed. More people learned sign language, inspired partly by Clara's example, and partly by the growing awareness that deaf people were capable and valuable members of the community. The school hired a teacher who knew sign language, allowing Catherine to attend classes with hearing children rather than being excluded. The church continued to provide interpreted services, and several businesses in town ensured they had at least one employee who could sign. Samuel never stopped learning. He read everything he could find about deaf education and deaf culture, about the debates raging in other parts of the country about whether deaf children should be forced to speak or allowed to sign. He corresponded with teachers at deaf schools, with advocates who were fighting for deaf rights, with other hearing people who'd married deaf spouses. He became an advocate himself, writing letters to territorial officials about the need for educational resources, speaking at town meetings about inclusion and accessibility. Clara told him once, many years into their marriage, that she never could have imagined the life they built together. She'd grown up believing she'd be alone, that no hearing man would ever truly understand or value her. She'd been rejected so many times that she'd started to believe the people who said she was too difficult, too limited, too much work. But Samuel had shown her differently, had proven through years of dedication and love that she was worth every effort, that their marriage was not despite her deafness, but rather enriched by the different perspectives and strengths they each brought. In 1890, Mackenzie retired and sold the triple bar to Samuel outright, a transaction made possible by years of profit-sharing and careful saving. Samuel and Clara became ranch owners, a position that came with new responsibilities and challenges, but also with tremendous satisfaction. They hired good people, treated them fairly, and built a reputation as one of the best operations in the territory. James, grown into a serious young man of 20, took over much of the day-to-day ranch management. Catherine, at 18, was considering attending a college for deaf students in Washington, D.C., wanting to become a teacher herself. Thomas, at 15, was still figuring out his path, but showed a gift for horse training that matched his father's. The cabin had been replaced years ago with a proper ranch house, spacious and comfortable, with a wide porch where Samuel and Clara still sat together in the evenings. signing about their day, their children, their plans and dreams. Arizona became a state in 1912, a momentous occasion that Samuel and Clara celebrated with their children and grandchildren gathered around. James had married a woman named Sarah, who'd learned sign language to communicate with her mother-in-law and deaf sister-in-law, and they had 4 children who all signed fluently. Catherine had indeed become a teacher, marrying a deaf man she'd met in Washington and running a small school for deaf children in Phoenix. Thomas had married young to a rancher's daughter and had taken over the day-to-day operations of the Triple Bar, allowing Samuel and Clara to step back into a well-earned semi-retirement. Samuel was 52 years old now, his hair graying and his face lined from decades of sun and wind. Clara was 49, still beautiful with silver threading through her dark hair and a grace in her movements that hadn't diminished with age. They'd been married for 33 years, and Samuel loved her more deeply now than he had on their wedding day. Their love deepened by shared experiences and challenges overcome, and a life built together from nothing but determination and commitment. One evening in late spring of 1912, Samuel and Clara sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, a mix of hearing and deaf children who communicated easily in whichever language suited the moment. Samuel watched them and felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not for the ranch he'd built or the success he'd achieved, but for the family they'd created, a family where deafness was accepted and valued, where sign language was as natural as spoken English. He turned to Clara and signed, "Do you remember the day we met, when my horse was shot and you came to offer sympathy?" Clara smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners in the way he loved. She signed back, "I remember thinking you were handsome and kind. I remember being surprised when you didn't seem bothered by my deafness. I remember hoping you might be different from the other men who'd courted me. I remember deciding right then that I wanted to know you better," Samuel signed. "I remember going to the library the next day to find a book on sign language. I remember being terrified that I would mess it up, that you would reject me. I remember when you signed to me for the first time," Clara signed, her movements tender with memory. "Your signing was terrible, but your effort was everything. No one had ever tried before. No one had ever seen me as worth that kind of work. You were worth it," Samuel signed emphatically. "You were worth learning a whole new language, worth every moment of effort and study and practice. Marrying you was the best decision I ever made. Building this life with you has been my greatest joy." Tears shone in Clara's eyes, but she was smiling as she signed. "You gave me something I never thought I could have. You gave me a voice in my own proposal, a chance to say yes in my own language. You gave me children who grew up seeing deafness as normal. You gave me a community that learned to include me rather than exclude me. You gave me everything." Samuel reached out and took her hand, holding it gently in both of his. He didn't need to sign what he wanted to say next. She could read it in his eyes. In the tender way, he brought her hand to his lips to kiss her knuckles. But he signed it anyway, because their love story had begun with his determination to learn her language, and it seemed right to express this moment in the words that were theirs alone. "I love you, Clara Greene. I have loved you for more than 3 decades, and I will love you until my last breath. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for being exactly who you are." Clara leaned in and kissed him, a gentle press of lips that held decades of love and partnership and shared joy. When she pulled back, she signed, "Thank you for learning my language. Thank you for seeing me when others looked past me. Thank you for being the man who made me believe I was worth loving. You changed my life, Samuel Greene." "You changed mine," Samuel signed back, they sat together as the sun finished setting and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Their grandchildren's laughter, both heard and silent, floated on the evening air. The ranch stretched out around them, a testament to hard work and shared dreams. And Samuel felt, with absolute certainty, that his life had turned out exactly as it was meant to, beginning with a gunshot that killed a horse and led him to the woman who would become his everything. The years continued to roll forward, bringing new joys and inevitable sorrows. Samuel's health began to decline in his 60s. Nothing dramatic, but the slow accumulation of decades of hard physical labor taking its toll on his body. Clara remained strong and vital, caring for him with the same dedication he'd shown her throughout their marriage. Their children and grandchildren visited often, filling the ranch house with the chaos and love of a large, close family. In 1925, Samuel and Clara celebrated their 46th wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 children, 12 grandchildren, and the first 2 great-grandchildren. It was a joyful occasion, with food and stories, and the kind of celebration that marked a life well lived, and a love that had endured through all challenges. Samuel was 73 now, Clara 70, and they moved more slowly but still signed to each other constantly, their conversations as rich and full as they'd been in their youth. That evening, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Samuel and Clara sat in the parlor together. Samuel's hands shook slightly with age as he signed, but his message was clear. "I am so grateful for every day I have had with you. You made my life extraordinary." Clara signed back, her movements still graceful despite her own age. "We made each other's lives extraordinary." That is what partnership means. That is what love means. Samuel nodded, then signed something he'd been thinking about for a while. "If I could go back and change anything, do you know what I would change? Nothing. Not a single moment. Even the hard times, even the struggles, they were all worth it because they were part of our story." "I would not change anything either," Clara signed. "Well, perhaps I would have learned to make better coffee sooner." "You were very patient about drinking terrible coffee for the first year of our marriage." Samuel laughed, the sound raspy but genuine. He signed. "Your coffee was terrible, but I would drink terrible coffee for 46 more years if it meant being with you." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, Clara's hand resting in Samuel's, their fingers intertwined. Then Clara signed. "Do you remember what you said when you proposed? That the answer would be ours in our own language, no one else's." "I remember," Samuel signed. "That is what our whole marriage has been," Clara signed. "Our own language built from sign and speech and love and understanding. A language no one else speaks exactly the way we do. A language that says we belong to each other, that we chose each other and kept choosing each other every day. That is what I will remember most. Not that you learned to sign, though that was important, but that you learned me the way I learned you and we built something entirely ours." Samuel felt tears prick his eyes. He signed. "You are a poet, my love. That is exactly what we did. We built something entirely ours." They went to bed that night holding hands as they had for 46 years, and Samuel felt a profound peace settle over him. Whatever years remained, he had lived a life full of love and purpose and meaning. He had learned a new language and gained a new world. He had raised children who saw past limitations to possibilities. He had built a legacy not just of land and cattle, but of inclusion and understanding and respect. Most importantly, he had loved Clara Hartley Greene with everything in him, and she had loved him back just as fiercely. Their love story had begun with rejection and deafness, and a cowboy determined to learn sign language. It had continued through decades of partnership and growth and shared joy. And it would endure, Samuel knew, long after both of them were gone, in the lives of their children and grandchildren who carried forward the lessons they'd learned about communication and respect, and the kind of love that transcends any barrier. Samuel lived 5 more years, passing peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1930 at the age of 78. Clara lived another 7 years beyond that, surrounded by family who made sure she was never lonely or isolated. When she died in 1937 at the age of 84, it was in the ranch house she and Samuel had built together, with her children and many of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered around to say goodbye. They buried her next to Samuel in the small cemetery on the ranch, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and dates and a single line in English and in the drawn symbols of sign language. They spoke with their hearts. The Triple Bar Ranch continued to operate for decades more, passed down through generations of Greenes who never forgot the story of how it all began. With a deaf woman who'd been rejected for something she couldn't change, and a cowboy who saw past the deafness to the extraordinary person underneath. With a man who learned sign language not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because he believed Clara was worth the effort, because he understood that real communication requires meeting someone in their language rather than demanding they meet you in yours. And most importantly, with a proposal where the answer was given in sign language, making it truly theirs, a perfect symbol of a love that was built on mutual respect, genuine understanding, and the willingness to learn new ways of seeing and being in the world. It was a love story for the ages, passed down through the family as a reminder that the best love stories are the ones where people choose to see past society's limitations and prejudices to the truth of another person's worth. The Triple Bar Ranch stood as testament to that love for generations. And though time eventually brought changes and the land was divided and sold, the story of Samuel and Clara Greene lived on. It lived on in family memories, and in letters preserved in archives, and in the way their descendants continued to value sign language and deaf culture. It lived on as an example of what real love looks like: patient, dedicated, willing to learn and grow and change. And it lived on as a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with ease but with barriers, and that those barriers become doorways when someone cares enough to learn a new language, to see the world through new eyes, and to build something beautiful out of determination and respect, and a love that refused to accept too difficult as an answer. Samuel and Clara Greene had built such a love, and though they were long gone, their legacy remained. A testament to the power of communication, the importance of inclusion, and the extraordinary things that become possible when someone decides that another person is worth every effort, worth learning a new language, worth building an entire life around. Their story ended not with drama or tragedy, but with the quiet satisfaction of lives fully lived, love fully given and received, and a family that carried forward the best of what they'd built together. It was, in every sense, a happily ever after earned through dedication and sustained through decades of partnership. And it began, as all the best love stories do, with one person seeing another truly and deciding that what they saw was worth everything,